The room smelled of copper and antiseptic. Sloane Harmon sat on the concrete floor with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, her hands still dark with blood that wasn't hers. The overhead light had been cut to a single lamp in the corner, and it threw long shadows across the cot where the man lay breathing, shallow at first, then slower, then steadier. The tourniquet on his left thigh was set correctly. The IV line ran clean. His pulse, when she pressed two fingers to the inside of his wrist, came back at 61 beats per minute. She exhaled once slowly through her nose. Ranger did not move from his position beside her left leg. The Belgian Malinois lay with his head on his forepaws and his amber eyes open, watching the door, the way only a working dog watches a door, not waiting for something good to come through it, but preparing for whatever might. The clock on the wall read 0247. She looked at the man on the cot. Private First Class Aaron Greer, 23 years old, who had walked into a door frame during a night training evolution and somehow managed to nick an artery that had no business being involved with a door frame. She had been called at midnight. She had stopped the bleeding in 8 minutes working by headlamp in a room with no proper surgical setup, using what she carried and what she knew. He would be transferred to Womack Army Medical Center at first light. He would spend 4 days there and would not fully understand for some time afterward how close the margin had been. He didn't need to understand. That was her job. She reached for the small green notebook on the floor beside her. She opened it to the last written page and wrote 4 words under the date and a grid reference she had noted in the margin 0244. Pulse stable, holding. Then she closed it and sat back. Outside, somewhere on the far side of Fort Bragg, a truck engine turned over and died. Footsteps passed down the hallway and faded. The base settled into the low hum of a night that had not yet decided what it wanted to become. The dining facility would open in less than 4 hours. A 3-star general would walk through its doors at 6:30 and choose the one table in the room that no one else ever chose. And the morning that followed would ask of Sloane Harmon something she had spent 10 years training herself not to give. She didn't know that yet. She only knew the clock read 0247, and Greer was breathing and Ranger was watching the door. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She had arrived at Fort Bragg 6 weeks earlier in the back of a white government van with 2 other corpsmen and a box of medical supplies packed by someone who had never worked a forward environment. The base absorbed her the way large institutions absorb new arrivals efficiently and without ceremony. She was assigned a bunk in the corner room of the medical quarters, given a badge, given a schedule, told to report to Master Chief Wade Briggs at 0600 the following morning. Briggs was a man who had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing in any unit was a gap between what someone claimed to be and what they actually were. He was 47 years old with a face that looked like it had been shaped under sustained pressure and a handshake that communicated his entire professional history in under 3 seconds. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had buried people because someone somewhere had overestimated their own competence, and he had organized his professional life around never allowing that to happen again. He looked at Sloane Harmon for a long moment when she walked into the briefing room that first morning. She was 26 years old and stood 5 feet 4 inches in her boots. Her hair was brown and pulled back according to regulation. She wore her uniform the way people wear clothes they are genuinely comfortable in, without effort, without self-consciousness. The patch on her left sleeve identified her as a Navy Corpsman E5 designation attached to the medical support element for a joint training rotation. Ranger walked in beside her left heel without a leash and sat when she sat. Briggs looked at the door. He looked at her. He said nothing yet. There were 7 other men in the room, SEAL operators assessed by profession and disposition, who took in the information of her presence with the professional thoroughness of people for whom accurate assessment was not a social nicety, but a survival skill. They looked at her rank, her size, her age, her dog. They made preliminary calculations. This was not hostility, it was reflex, and most of them were not yet aware they were doing it. Petty Officer First Class Kyle Stone was 34 broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something harder than ordinary bone. He addressed Briggs rather than Sloane when he spoke, which was its own kind of statement. Standard Corpsman rotation, Master Chief? Her file's solid, Briggs said. Files and field time aren't the same thing. No, Briggs said, they're not. He let that sit for 1 beat, then moved on to the briefing. Sloane did not react to Stone's words. She did not look at him. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Ranger turned his head and regarded Stone with the focused, unhurried attention of an animal that has learned to read human intention better than most humans can. Stone met the dog's gaze briefly, then looked back at the board. Senior Chief Cole Whitfield sat at the far end of the table. He was 51 years old and had the economy of movement of a man who had long since stopped spending energy on things that didn't require it. He watched the exchange between Stone and Briggs without comment. He watched Sloane not react to it. He watched the way she held her pen steady, no excess pressure, writing in the small, precise hand of someone accustomed to taking notes in conditions that made precision difficult. He filed it without remark and said nothing. He had been in this business long enough to know that the most interesting people in any room were rarely the ones drawing attention. 3 days into the rotation, Briggs assembled the full team for a conditioning run. 11 miles through the pine terrain northeast of the main post, 45 pounds per person. Before they stepped off, Stone made a comment to Petty Officer Second Class Everett Webb, casual enough to be deniable, loud enough to be heard, about whether the medical element would need its own medevac before the halfway point. Webb laughed. Beef. He was 28, good-natured by disposition, and had not yet fully developed the judgment to know when a laugh was a test. Sloane heard it. She adjusted her pack straps and stepped into line. At mile 4, the terrain rose through red clay and loose stone. At mile 6, the temperature had climbed past 90 degrees. At mile 8, Stone turned his head and found Sloane Harmon 3 paces behind him, breathing controlled, pack straight, eyes forward, moving with the undemonstrative steadiness of someone who had done this before. He turned back around. He did not collect on the bet. He did not mention it again. But he did not change his underlying assessment. Not yet, because what she had shown him was only endurance, and endurance was the minimum. That third evening, Whitfield was passing the medical quarters around 2100 when he noticed the light still on in the small room Sloane used for administrative work. He slowed. The door was half open. He looked in without announcing himself, intending only a glance. She was at the desk with an older notebook open in front of her. Not the standard green field book she carried in her kit, but something worn soft with handling, its cover gone dark at the corners. The pages were dense with handwriting and small, careful diagrams. From where he stood, the diagrams were clearly not anatomical. Topographical elevation lines, sightline calculations, notations about wind corridors and range markers, laid out in the measured, systematic hand of someone who had been doing this for years. He recognized the format. He had seen it in the hands of men who worked at distances where most people could not reliably see their target. He stood in the hallway for 2 more seconds. Then he continued walking, and he did not go back, and he did not ask her about it. Some information came when it was ready, and not before. He had learned that the hard way early enough in his career that the lesson had stuck. What he did instead was adjust where he stood in rooms she was also in, and how much of his attention he directed toward her, and how carefully he began to watch. The heat came in hard on the 9th day. A joint exercise on the East Range, full team movement through open terrain under loads simulating approach conditions for a desert insert. At 1100, the temperature was 94. By 1300, it had touched 98. The team managed as experienced operators do, compensating without being asked. Everett Webb did not mention the headache that had been sitting behind his eyes since 0300. He did not mention that he had eaten nothing that morning, or that something had been wrong with the back of his neck since mile 2 in a way he could not name. He had completed 2 combat deployments without complaint. He was 28 years old and not in the habit of flagging discomfort before it became a problem. By the time it was becoming a problem, Sloane had been watching him for 40 minutes. Not obviously, she had not separated herself from the group to stare. She had positioned herself at the correct angle through 3 movement changes, and she was tracking small things, the micro expressions around his eyes, the quality of his stride, the 2 moments in the last quarter mile where his head had turned as if adjusting to something in his peripheral vision that wasn't there. When the team reached a rally point in the shade of a tree line, she moved to Webb without preamble and crouched in front of him. She looked at his eyes, not into them, but at them, and took his pulse at the wrist. 11 seconds. She stood and looked at Briggs. "Chief," her voice did not climb, "if you don't pull him back right now, you'll need a medevac in under 15 minutes. Briggs looked at Webb. Webb prepared to argue, and then something behind his eyes made its own calculation, and he sat down on a nearby rock because his body had decided for him. It was not heat exhaustion. She said that quietly and precisely. The distinction mattered medically, and she stated it as fact. She started an IV, got fluids running, moved him into full shade, and monitored his temperature as it came down over the following 20 minutes. She explained what she was doing and why, in clipped factual language, and she did not dramatize any of it. Stone watched from 12 feet away. When Webb's color started coming back and the man managed a weak version of his usual grin, Stone turned to Whitfield and said, "She got lucky. He didn't look that bad." Whitfield studied the IV line and the color of Webb's recovery for a moment. She read his pupils from 5 meters, he said, while walking. Stone had no response to that. 2 days later, during a close-quarters training evolution, an operator named Garrett came down wrong from a wall obstacle and landed on his left shoulder. He shook it off and kept moving. He had landed on that shoulder before. Sloan had been observing the evolution. She watched the landing. After the station rotation, she walked over and asked Garrett to stop for a moment in the tone of voice that made stopping feel like the more efficient choice. She ran her hand along the front of his shoulder joint, asked him to resist 3 specific movement directions, watched his face rather than his arm while he did it. Then she told him what she believed was wrong and why it mattered if he continued. A superior labrum tear anterior to posterior. Not a strain, surgical territory within the next several weeks if he kept loading the joint. He stared at her. How do you know that? I've seen it before. He went to medical that evening. The imaging confirmed what she had said. He did not ask again where she had learned it because the answer was evident and the question would have been beside the point. The week after that, Whitfield found himself in the equipment bay when Sloan came in to log out a resupply. The bay held weapons alongside medical inventory, a combined facility practical if imperfect. While she was checking her list against the manifest, an operator set a Sig Sauer P2.26 on the shelf beside her to free his hands for a kit inspection. The gun sat there 18 inches from where she was working. Without pausing in what she was doing, without appearing to make a conscious decision about it, her right hand moved and picked up the pistol, rotated it twice to confirm the chamber. Verified safe, set it back down. The motion was fluid in the way that things are fluid when they have passed below the level of thought, when the mechanics have been repeated enough times that the hands do the work before the mind issues the instruction. She did not appear to notice she had done it. The operator looked at his gun, looked at her, went back to his kit. Whitfield stood very still for a moment. Then he finished what he was doing and left the bay, and that evening he walked to the small room where she did her administrative work and knocked. Ranger raised his head from the floor but did not stand. Harmon, she looked up from her notebook. What did your father do? Something in the room shifted, though nothing moved. She held the pen and looked at him with the careful steadiness of someone making a decision about how much to offer. He's gone, she said. I know. What did he do? She held his gaze for another moment. Then she closed the notebook and set it on the desk. Good night, Senior Chief. He held her look for one more second, then nodded once and left. He did not push it. He had the information he needed. For now, she was not what her paperwork said. She was something else, something older than 26, something that had been placed in a uniform and directed toward a bomb and was doing that job correctly, but carried inside it a different vocabulary, a different set of reflexes, a different map of how the world was organized. He had spent his career around people like that. He had never encountered a woman exactly like this one. He began without announcing it to anyone to watch out for her. The notebook under her mattress contained, among other things, a record she had been keeping since her second full day on base. Each entry followed the same format: date, location, activity, observed, time, anomalies noted. The handwriting was small and deliberate. The notation system was salute format. It read like a field intelligence log because that was what it was. The entries about Building 7 began in her second week. A vehicle had arrived on a Tuesday evening at 2140, back to the loading dock, and been gone by 0030. The following Friday, a different vehicle, same dock, same window. She had noted plate numbers where visible vehicle types personnel count. She had noted that on 3 occasions personnel she could not identify by unit or badge had entered the building and remained long enough to indicate they were not making deliveries. She had noted that no corresponding activity appeared in the logistics schedule. She had not spoken of it to anyone. There was a larger picture forming, and she was a patient woman. Patience had been one of her father's first lessons, not the passive kind, not endurance, but active patience. The discipline of watching until you understood what you were looking at before deciding what to do about it. He had taught her in the woods behind the house in Oregon, in the early mornings when the light came through the Douglas firs and low horizontal bars, and the ground smelled of pine and cold water. She did not think about him more than was useful. She ate breakfast alone. This was not isolation. It was a practical choice based on a set of practical factors. The table at the far corner of the dining facility gave her clean sight lines to the primary entrance, both side exits and the kitchen serving area. The ambient noise level was lowest in that corner. Ranger could work the room's scent from that position without obstruction. She drank black coffee and ate without hurrying, and wrote in her notebook and did not look up unless something gave her reason to. On the 42nd morning of her rotation, what gave her reason was the absence of something she expected. Lieutenant General Edward Carver walked into the dining facility at 0631, and 200 people did what people do when 3 stars walk into a room. They registered the presence, adjusted their posture, recalibrated. Carver was 63 years old, large in the way of men who have stayed physically serious their entire lives, and he carried his rank without theater. He raised one hand in the low gesture that meant at ease. I'm just getting coffee, and most of the room settled. He moved to the coffee station, poured a cup, and stood with his back to the room for a moment. When he turned, he scanned. The way operators scan, not looking for a specific thing, looking for anything at all. His eyes moved through the room and found at the table in the far corner a young corpsman writing in a notebook with a Belgian Malinois at her feet. The dog he noticed first, not the breed or the size, the position. The animal was lying at 45 degrees from its handler's chair, which put the room's entrances in its sightline. It was not asleep. Its eyes were tracking. The second thing he noticed was that the corpsman had not looked up when he walked in. Not because she hadn't noticed. He was certain she had noticed. She had registered his entry, made a calculation, and returned to her notebook. In a room of 200 people, she was alone in that response. He picked up his cup and walked across the room. The distance was long enough that 3 tables of operators tracked his movement with the restrained attention of people who will not speak unless spoken to. He did not stop. He walked to the far corner table and stood beside the empty chair. Ranger's head came up. "Can I sit here?" She looked up. She did it without hurry, without the slight flinching quality that rank produces in junior personnel who are startled. She looked at him directly, assessed the question, and looked at the chair. "It's free, sir." He sat. He set his coffee on the table. He looked at Ranger, who was now sitting upright with his full attention on Carver, not hostile, not deferential. Evaluating. "He always worked like that?" Carver asked. "He's always working," she said. "Even at breakfast." "Especially at breakfast." A brief pause. "Most people don't expect anything to happen at breakfast." Carver considered this. He wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at the open notebook. He could see from his angle that the margins held small notations in a hand too fine to read from across the table, and that the lower corner of the open page contained what appeared to be a sketch of a grid reference. He looked back at her. She was watching the room without appearing to watch it, the eyes forward, the attention spread wide. He knew that specific technique. He had taught it himself once in a different building, in a different decade. "How long have you been on rotation here?" he asked. 6 weeks, sir." "You find the work useful?" Something moved briefly in her expression, not amusement, something quieter. "I find it necessary," she said. He was about to follow that thread when Ranger moved. No sound, no bark, no growl. The dog rose in one fluid motion, stood with his legs squared and his nose oriented toward the far end of the serving area, and the fur along at his spine lifted slowly the way a tide comes in, inevitable, unhurried, not to be argued with. Sloane put the pen down. She was already looking toward the serving area, and her right hand moved down to the hem of her jacket and stopped there because she was in a dining facility and she was not carrying, and she knew it. Her eyes were doing the calculation. 3 seconds. Carver watched all of it. He did not speak. 30 years of operational service had given him a specific sensitivity to the behavior of working dogs, and what he was watching was not an animal reacting to a dropped plate. He set his cup down without sound and straightened in his chair. "Sir," her voice was level, "I need you to move toward the south exit. Now, the way you'd move if nothing was wrong." It was not phrased as a junior enlisted person petitioning a 3-star general. It was phrased as a statement of operational necessity by someone who had completed the relevant calculation and arrived at a conclusion. He stood up. She was already moving toward the serving area, not the exit, with Ranger at her left heel. She moved through the breakfast crowd with the quiet, directional certainty of someone who knows what she's heading toward and has already determined the path. Around them, the facility continued in its morning rhythms. Forks on plates, the industrial cycling of coffee machines. A group of Rangers near the west windows, laughing about something, the rare voices carrying across the room in the ordinary way of people who believe the morning is unremarkable. She reached the facility sergeant at the serving counter and spoke 4 words. The sergeant looked at her rank and looked at her face and made the correct decision, the way people make correct decisions when the person speaking to them has a quality in their voice that removes the option of being wrong. He moved his staff toward the rear corridor without announcing a reason. She did not run. She did not raise her voice. She moved through the room in a low, steady register, and the people around her responded to something in the quality of that register, a controlled urgency, a certainty, and the room emptied with the relative speed and calm of people who have been given a reason to move and have decided to believe it. Within 4 minutes, 200 people were outside. Carver stood near the south exit and watched her work. He assessed it the way he assessed everything, with the analytical attention of someone who had spent his career studying how people operate under conditions that remove the option of being wrong. He watched where her eyes went. He watched the economy of her communication, how much information she transmitted with how few words. He watched Ranger track through the space along a specific vector, following something invisible to everyone else in the room. The dog stopped at a pallet of sealed institutional food containers stacked near the back of the serving line. He sat. He did not look at Sloane. He looked at the pallet. She crouched beside the containers. From the front pocket of her kit bag, she removed a small test strip in a clear plastic, housing a narrow piece of treated paper that did not appear in any Navy Corpsman field kit Carver had reviewed. She opened the top container by less than an inch and inserted the strip. 4 seconds. She withdrew it. Pale blue. She looked at it without moving. Then she stood and turned around. Carver was standing 6 feet behind her. He had crossed the room without being directed to. She held up the strip. "That's not standard Corpsman issue," he said. "No, sir. But you carry it." She looked at the strip for a moment before answering. "My father sent me a package the year before he died. Field tools, he called them. Things he said a careful person should always have on hand." She turned the strip in the light. He didn't explain why. He never explained why things in advance. He said, "You'll know if you ever need them." Carver looked at the strip. He looked at her face. Something moved behind his eyes that did not reach his expression. "What does that color tell you?" "Someone put something in the food supply. Not concentrated enough to kill, concentrated enough to incapacitate. 200 people off their feet for 6 to 8 hours." She looked at him steadily. "Today is the first day of your inspection." He stood very still. "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked once at Ranger, who had not moved from his position beside the pallet, still regarding the containers with the focused patience of an animal that has done what it was trained to do and is waiting for the people around it to catch up. Sir, she said, "we need to secure this area and move to a controlled space." He looked at her for a moment. He had spent a long career distinguishing between people who were managing him and people who were managing a situation. She was managing the situation. "Agreed," he said. She pulled her radio and requested a security detail without identifying the nature of the request. Then she moved toward the exit, and Ranger moved beside her, and Carver fell in a half-pace behind, because that was where the situation had placed him. Outside, the base moved in its ordinary morning rhythms. Personnel crossed the quad. Vehicles traveled the access roads. Nobody knew yet. The world was still in the version of itself where breakfast at Fort Bragg was unremarkable. Carver walked and thought about the test strip in her kit bag. He thought about the topographical notations in her notebook. He thought about the way she had emptied a room of 200 people in under 5 minutes without raising her voice, and the way she had placed herself between him and the contaminated supply without appearing to do it deliberately. He thought about her hands. She had picked up the test strip with her left hand, set it down with her left hand. When her hand had moved to her hip in the serving area, it had been the right hand reaching without thought across her body toward a weapon she wasn't carrying, a reflex stronger than intention. He had seen that cross-body reach before. He had seen it paired in one specific case, with eyes exactly that shade of gray in exactly that quality of stillness. He would ask her about it. But there was work to do first. The secured briefing room had no windows and a single overhead lamp that cast the space in flat, even light. Carver sat across from Sloane Harmon and set on the table between them a folder he had carried from Washington, physical paper, not digital, the kind of document you keep off network systems when you are not certain which systems are clean. 14 months, he said, 3 operations, compromised before deployment, each time in a way that standard security variants cannot explain. He opened the folder but did not push it toward her. 31 personnel exposed, 14 dead. She looked at the folder. She did not reach for it. The operational approval chain for all 3 was the same. Same command node, same authorization signature. He paused. Colonel Robert Dean. The name settled in the room. Ranger's head moved a small adjustment, chin lifting slightly, nostrils expanding twice in quick succession. He resettled, but his eyes had shifted toward the door. Sloane watched Ranger for 2 seconds. Then she opened her own notebook and slid it across the table. Carver looked at the pages. It took him a moment to orient to the format, then another to understand what he was reading, and then he was still. The entries went back 6 weeks. Each followed the same structure: time, location, observed activity, vehicle description, personnel count. The handwriting was small and deliberate. The grid references were precise. He checked two against his own internal map of the facility and found them accurate. The entries about Building 7 began on day 9. Tuesday and Friday evenings, he said, always between 2100 and 100. Different vehicles each time. The plate on the third Tuesday was a contractor registration out of Fayetteville, but the vehicle type didn't match that contractor's fleet. She reached across and turned to a page near the back. No corresponding entry in the base logistics schedule. I checked it through the administrative portal 3 times over 4 weeks. You have portal access, medical clearance badge, standard access for that level. He looked at her steadily. This is not standard corpsman observation practice. No, sir. Then I'll ask you again. Who sent you here? She held his gaze. The thing he had been trying to categorize about her was clearer to him. Now it wasn't composure in the ordinary sense. It was something more specific, the steadiness of a person who has made a fundamental decision about what she will and will not disclose and is holding that boundary with a quiet certainty that does not require raising her voice or breaking eye contact. I came here as a medical support attachment, she said. That part is true. And the other part? The other part is mine, sir. A knock at the door. Carver said, "Come in," without looking away from her. Senior Chief Cole Whitfield entered the room in his duty uniform, carrying nothing with the self-possessed ease of a man who has arrived exactly where he intended to be. Carver looked at him. Sloan looked at him without surprise. Something passed between them, not a signal, not a transfer of information. An acknowledgement. "I don't believe I requested you, Senior Chief," Carver said. "No, sir." Whitfield pulled out the chair at the table's end and sat. "I've been watching Harmon for 2 weeks and Building 7 for 10 days independently. Our observations overlap." He looked at the notebook. "I didn't have a notebook." He said it plainly, without apology or performance. This was a man reporting a fact. Carver studied him. Then he looked back at the notebook. Outside through the walls, the base was processing the morning's event with the organized efficiency of an institution that has protocols for everything. Protocols that at this moment ran through the office of the base commander. "Dean has full oversight of this facility," Carver said. "Any formal request to inspect Building 7 go through his office." "Yes, sir," Whitfield said. "He would know before I finished writing it." The room was quiet. Sloan said, "There's something else." She turned to the last entry in her notebook. "Last night, 0244, a vehicle arrived at Building 7's loading dock. Stayed 40 minutes. 3 personnel in non-standard clothing. One carrying a case the type used for data storage equipment transport." Carver read the entry. He looked at the time notation. "You were observing the building at 0244. I was in the medical quarters. The window faces the eastern compound." She paused. "Whoever is in that building is running down a clock. Your arrival would have accelerated it." "So would the food supply failing this morning," Whitfield said. "Yes," she said. "The contamination wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to put you in the medical wing for 8 to 12 hours while the last of the material inside was moved out. After which, Building 7 becomes an empty logistics warehouse and the inspection finds nothing." Carver sat back. He had spent a career distinguishing truth from its imitations, and he was listening now with everything he had developed in that career. He was not finding the fraction of a second delays, the micro-hesitations, the places where a story seams showed. What he was finding instead was a kind of knowledge that troubled him in a different way, the fluency with which she thought about vehicle patterns and material removal and operational timelines. The vocabulary she brought to it. That was not corpsman training. "Tonight," he said, "we move on Building 7 at dark. The 3 of us." He looked at Whitfield. "You said you could be useful." "Yes, sir." "We'll find out." He looked at Sloan. "And you'll tell me the rest of what I need to know about who you are before we go in." "I'll tell you what I can," she said. "That will have to be enough." They had 4 hours. Sloan spent most of them in the medical quarters preparing with the focused discipline of someone who treats preparation as a form of respect for the mission, for the people beside you, for the near certain likelihood that something will not go as planned. She checked her kit twice. She changed the dressing on her left forearm, where a shard of glass from the dining facility window had found her during the evacuation, shallow clean, not enough to slow her, but enough to require attention. She ate at 1500 because she had learned young that you eat when you can and you sleep when you can, and you do not expect either to be available when you want them. Ranger sat beside her and worked the room. She let herself think about things she generally kept at a distance during operational preparation. Sometimes before something, the mind loosened its hold on the immediate and reached back not for comfort, but for calibration. She had learned not to fight it. The memory moved through on its own terms, and it was better to let it pass than to spend energy holding it back. The rucksack had been heavier than she was that first morning. She had been 9 years old and the pack was military surplus, and her father had loaded it himself with a precise 15 pounds, and he had told her it would not feel like 15 pounds in the first hour, but it would feel exactly like 15 pounds in the fourth hour. The difference between how something feels and what something is would matter to her someday. She had not known what he meant. She understood it before noon. Ray Harmon had been a quiet man, not cold quiet. There was a distinction she had needed years to understand. He was quiet in the way of deep moving water, purposeful beneath a surface that gave away very little. He said things once directly and waited for them to land, and when they did not land, he said them again in the same words because he trusted the words and believed that the problem was timing rather than language. Over 7 years, he had taught her to shoot mornings in the Oregon woods, starting with a .22 and working upward through calibers that each had their own personality, their own demands on the body and the mind. He taught her mechanics first, then discipline, then something harder to name, the understanding that every shot was a decision and decisions had weight, and the weight was carried forward regardless of outcome. This isn't about killing anything, he had told her when she was 12. They were prone on a hillside in September with a deer 400 meters out in the wind steady from the northwest. It's about understanding that what you do has consequences, real ones. Out here, there's nowhere to hide from what you decide. He had adjusted her grip with 2 fingers, a minimal correction. Someday that's going to matter. She had asked why this particular lesson, why the rifle, why the hillside. He had thought about it for a while. Because this is honest, he finally said. Most of what people do, they can talk their way around. This you can't. She had been 16 when the officer knocked on the door. She had been in the kitchen. She heard the tone of the conversation before she heard the words, and she set down the glass she was holding and stood at the counter and waited for the world to finish rearranging itself. Afghanistan, killed in action. No further details at this time. Her mother had held her hands that evening and asked her to promise. The voice she used was the one that had no hedge in it, no exit. Sloan had recognized it. She had promised. She had kept that promise for 10 years. She looked at her hands now. She flexed her fingers, once feeling the familiar tension in the tendons, the specific weight of muscle memory that did not diminish no matter how long she asked it to stay quiet. Ranger put his chin on her knee. She sat with her hand on the back of his neck, and outside the light moved through afternoon into evening, and the base continued in its routines, and somewhere in Building 7, the loading dock waited for the truck that was scheduled to arrive at 0300 and take away whatever remained. The approach to Building 7 took 22 minutes. They moved along the eastern fence line in the shadow of the equipment sheds that ran parallel to the perimeter road. Whitfield led, Sloan followed with Ranger at heel. Carver moved last with the economy of a man whose body remembered this grammar even if it had been some years since he had used it. It was 1940 hours. The light had gone gray and was moving toward dark, and this section of the base was quiet, with the specific quiet of an area between operational cycles. Webb was positioned on overwatch at the southern corner of the compound, behind a maintenance shed with a radio and a clean angle on the western approach road. He had volunteered before Sloan finished asking. He was the kind of person who paid debts promptly. Briggs did not know about this yet. That was a problem for later. They reached the tree line at the eastern edge of the logistics compound and stopped. Whitfield raised a fist. The building was dark. A vehicle, civilian unmarked, was parked at the south end of the loading dock. Earlier than the pattern she had recorded, the timeline had shifted, which meant her assessment about acceleration had been right. She keyed her radio twice. Webb keyed back once, clear from his position. They moved to the edge of the tree line and held. It happened fast, as these things do. Webb's voice came low over the radio. Movement, east corner, coming your direction. The man appeared from the far end of the building. Not the dock, the far end, moving along the wall with the purposeful speed of someone who has just understood that something has changed and is acting before the understanding is complete. Civilian clothes, a second figure 10 feet behind him, right hand holding something that caught the fading light. The first shot came from the second figure. It went wide, but not wide enough. The sound tore the air apart and Whitfield was moving left, and Carver went down behind a concrete barrier, and Sloan pulled Ranger by his collar because his training said hold and her hand said otherwise. The first figure reached a position at the corner of a maintenance structure 40 meters from the tree line. The second moved toward the loading dock's exterior ladder going up, climbing to the roof of the small outbuilding attached to the building's south end. From that elevation, he would have angle on everything below him. Whitfield's voice flat and close. Webb is hit. She heard it at the same moment she heard Webb's voice on the radio controlled working to stay that way, telling her what she already knew. Left shoulder. He could function. He was down behind the shed and not mobile. She ran two calculations simultaneously. First, the tactical position. Second, what was happening to Webb's shoulder at this moment, and what would be happening to it in 6 minutes if no one addressed it. Both calculations mattered. They could not be separated. The figure on the roof had angle on Carver. Carver could hold his position for now, but now was a currency with a fixed and diminishing value. Whitfield from behind a tree. We don't have a long gun. She looked at the vehicle near the loading dock. Standard JSOC support vehicle, Barrett M82A1 in the rear cargo section. She had verified the vehicle inventory on day 3 of the rotation because she verified everything on day 3. She knew what was in every vehicle she had regular access to. 870 meters to the figure on the roof. She had not touched a long gun in 2 years. 2 years, 3 months, and some days she had not bothered to count precisely because precision in that direction had seemed like the wrong kind of discipline. Her father's voice without announcement, someday that's going to matter. She looked at Webb's last known position. She could not see him from here. She could calculate what was happening to him, and what she calculated said that Whitfield reaching him in the next 4 minutes was the margin. And Whitfield could not reach him while the figure on the roof held that position. She looked at Carver. He was watching her from behind his barrier, his face very still in the dimming light. He did not ask her for anything. He simply held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who has been in this particular geometry before and is waiting to find out which person in the room has the relevant capability and whether that person is going to use it. She closed her eyes for 1 full second. She opened them and went to the vehicle. The Barrett was in its case in the rear cargo section. She pulled it and moved to the vehicle's lee, set the bipod on the hood. 30 pounds. She knew the weight. Her body settled into it before her mind finished reminding it how. She adjusted the bipod, found the figure through the scope elevated above her 870 meters, moving incrementally, working his position on the outbuilding roof. Wind. She wet her finger. 9 knots bearing northwest. She adjusted the scope. Bullet drop at 870 in near still air was a calculation she had done often enough that the result arrived before the process finished. She confirmed it. Her heart rate was at 82. She needed it below 72. She breathed in for 4 counts. Held. Released over 8. She felt the rate come down, not all the way, but enough. Reticle on target. She exhaled the last third of her breath, held the stillness at the bottom of the exhale, where the body quiets between heartbeats, and her finger moved. The shot went left by 6 inches. She knew before she saw the result, a fraction of wind correction missing the bearing, having shifted 2 degrees in the last 40 seconds. She cycled the bolt, did not adjust her breathing or her grip or her position. She corrected only the elevation and windage, 2 small movements of the scope dial. Her heart rate was at 67. She exhaled. She found the window. Her finger moved. The figure on the roof went down. She held the scope picture for 2 full seconds, confirming. Then she was in motion off the vehicle kit bag from the cargo section, moving toward Webb at a pace that was not running, but was faster than anything else available. Stone's voice came over the radio. He had been on the outer perimeter as backup, and in the focus of the last 4 minutes, she had not thought about him, and now he was there on the radio, and his voice carried something new in it. The professional skepticism that had been its baseline register since the first morning was gone, not replaced by warmth or admiration, but simply absent like a frequency that had been switched off. Doc. A pause that held more weight than most sentences. Where did you learn that? She did not answer. She was already at Webb's position, cutting away the uniform over his shoulder, assessing the wound, while her hands moved without waiting for her eyes to finish their work. Through and through, anterior deltoid, clean entry and exit, no joint involvement, no arterial compromise. Serious. Not catastrophic. She applied a hemostatic dressing with the focused economy of someone who has done this enough times that the motion sequence lives in her hands independent of the rest of her. Ow, Webb said. Yes. Did you just don't talk? Breathe slow. He breathed slow. She worked. Ranger positioned himself at Webb's feet and held the perimeter with patient, systematic attention. Whitfield reached them 40 seconds later. He looked at the dressing, looked at Sloan, looked toward the roof of the outbuilding where the figure had fallen. 870, he said. 868, she said. The wind shifted. He was quiet for a moment, processing something. She picked up her kit bag and stood. Carver was there. He had come up beside her in the last 30 seconds. He stood at her left, and something was different about the way he occupied the space, as if he had reorganized something interior, and the reorganization had not fully settled. Harmon, he said. She looked at him. Your father's name. The question fell into the cooling evening air between them. She held it. Ray Harmon, she said. He was quiet for a count of 3. For Carver, that was a long time. Master Sergeant Ray Harmon, he said, not a question. Delta Force, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Kuwait, 1991. He was one of the best people I have worked alongside in 30 years. That is not sentiment. It is a technical assessment. She did not move. Something behind her eyes went still in a way that was different from trained stillness, the stillness of someone who has been walking toward a door for a long time and has just arrived at it. You knew him. I did. He never mentioned you. He wouldn't. Compartmentalization was not doctrine for him. It was disposition. He looked at her hands. He shot with his left hand when a situation elevated. Under pressure, the dominant hand took over, and his dominant hand was his left. I watched him in Kuwait, in a situation I cannot describe in detail, but have thought about many times since. He paused. You do the same. She said nothing. I noticed it this morning in the dining facility. I was going to ask you about it, and then the morning moved faster than the conversation. He held her gaze. There is something I need to tell you about your father. I have been carrying it for 10 years, and I have been wrong to carry it this long. He paused. Not here, once this building is secured and we know what we have inside then. Tonight, before I leave this compound. You said not tonight. I said not here. There is a difference. Something shifted in his face briefly. I brought something with me from Washington. I bring it on every assignment, every deployment, every inspection. I told myself it was because the moment hadn't come. The truth is, I was afraid of the conversation. He looked at the building. Tonight has removed that option. She looked at him steadily. The calculation she was running was visible only in the slight tension at her jaw. All right, she said. Whitfield, quietly, we still have Building 7. They had Building 7. The interior was not what most people would have expected to find in a logistics storage facility at Fort Bragg. The shelving units that should have held maintenance inventory had been cleared and replaced with a system of portable server racks, half already stripped, cables, hanging panels removed. The remaining units were still active, their indicator lights blinking in the dark with the patient indifference of machines that do not register the circumstances around them. Along the eastern wall in sealed transit cases of the type used for archival materials, transport rows of labeled boxes. Sloan moved to the nearest and read the label. Then the next. Then the next. She stopped. She looked at Carver. He read the label from where he stood. Operational files, he said. 14 years. JSOC classified actions unredacted. She looked along the row. Source identities. Field personnel assignments. Active cover documentation. She looked at the server racks. And whatever was on these before half of them were pulled. Whoever has those drives, Whitfield said from near the door, has the names of everyone currently operating under non-official cover. The room held the particular silence of a space where something significant is being understood for the first time, even though it has been true for much longer. It was Ranger who moved first, not toward the door. He turned from the south wall and faced the interior corridor, running along the building's western side, and he held that position with his body in the configuration Sloan had learned to read with the same fluency she read text. Not alert, not aggression, recognition. Ranger, she said quietly. He did not look at her. He stayed fixed on the corridor. The footsteps came from the western end, deliberate, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who has calculated that hurrying is no longer the relevant response. Colonel Robert Dean walked into the server room in his duty uniform, hands visible at his sides, and looked at the three of them with the expression of a man who has been preparing for a scenario that has arrived slightly ahead of the preferred schedule. He looked at Carver first, then Whitfield, then Sloan, then he looked at Ranger. The dog had not moved. His eyes were on Dean with a quality that was different from how he regarded threats. Not warning, something older, more specific, the certainty of a nose that has stored a scent deep enough that no duration of time erases it. Dean looked at the pot for 1 second longer than necessary. Then he looked away. Sloane saw it. She filed it the way she filed everything without expression in the part of her that had been keeping records since her second week on this base. She would think about what that extra second meant. She would think about FOB al-Assad in Iraq in 2022, where Ranger had spent 18 months with Petty Officer Tyler Voss, and who might have moved through that environment during those months, and whether presence at a time and location was the same as complicity in what happened at that location. She would think about all of it. But first there was tonight. General Dean said, "I heard there was an incident at the East Compound." "There was," Carver said. "I came to assess." "I know you did." The two men looked at each other. Outside, across the base, a radio crackled briefly and went quiet. Ranger had not moved. His amber eyes held Dean's face with the fixed, complete attention of an animal that does not have opinions about the humans. It watches only information. Sloane stood beside the transit cases and said nothing. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about the way Carver had said his name, not as a file entry, not as a record, but as a person he had known and missed. She was thinking about what Carver was going to tell her and whether she was ready for what it was. She did not know. The not knowing had a shape to it. She recognized something she was going to have to carry, regardless of whether she felt ready to carry it. Dean looked at the server racks. He looked at the transit cases along the wall. He looked at Carver with the expression of a man who has rehearsed a number of possible versions of this moment and is selecting among them. "This area is part of an ongoing classified operation," he said. "I'm not in a position to..." "Don't," Carver said. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It landed with the weight of someone who has run out of patience for a particular kind of maneuvering and is not going to pretend otherwise. "You ran a source for 11 years, Carver said. "You compromised 3 operations and spent 14 lives doing it, and you stored the documentation of it in a building on this base because you believed no one would look. You were wrong about the last part." He paused. "The drives you moved will locate them. The vehicles from Tuesday and Friday nights, we have the plates. The personnel you used, they will cooperate when given the alternative." He looked at Dean steadily. "I have been in this business for 30 years, Robert. I know how these things resolve." Dean held his expression for a moment longer than it could sustain itself. Something went out of it, not dramatically, not with collapse, but in the way a held position becomes untenable, and the body begins to release it before the mind has given permission. He looked at Ranger one more time. Ranger looked back at him with eyes that held no judgment. Only information, the unambiguous information of an animal that has cataloged a scent and stored it and produced it again across time and distance. "Dogs don't testify," Dean said. His voice had lost some of its evenness. "No," Sloane said, "but drives do, and so do the 3 people who were in this room when you walked in." Whitfield had moved to Dean's 10 o'clock during the exchange through the blind angles without announcing it in the way experienced operators move in enclosed spaces. He was there now, positioned and ready. Carver lifted his radio. He spoke 4 words into it. The security element that had been staged at the perimeter came through the western corridor within 90 seconds. 3 personnel moving with the purposeful speed of people who have been waiting for exactly this call. Dean looked at them. He made the final calculation of the evening, which was that there was no calculation left to make. He did not resist. He let them take his arms, and Whitfield moved in to assist, and Ranger tracked Dean across every step of it until he was out of the room and the corridor door closed. Carver watched until the sound of footsteps had faded down the corridor. Then he stood in the server room with the blinking indicator lights and the rows of transit cases and looked at all those years of decisions and consequences stored in sealed boxes along a wall. He stood there for a long moment. "Webb needs a hospital," he said. Sloane was already moving. The base operated with the organized urgency it reserves for situations that require it. Vehicles moved, buildings lit. The laboratory processing the dining facility samples would have results before midnight, and those results would confirm what the test strip had already established, and the confirmation would move through channels that Dean no longer had access to because Dean was no longer in a position to access anything. Webb was in surgery by 21:30. The wound was clean, she had told him so, and the surgical team confirmed it 40 minutes later. Anterior deltoid, no joint involvement, no arterial damage. 6 weeks in a sling. He would complain about the sling for months. He would be fine by spring. Stone came in from the outer perimeter when the building was secured. He stood in the corridor outside the server room for a while looking at the transit cases through the open door. Then he found Sloane in the vehicle bay packing her kit, and he came in and stood in the door for a moment before he crossed the floor. He was not built for this kind of thing. She could see it in the effort it cost him, the deliberate loosening of his posture, the conscious decision to be less defended than his nature preferred. "I was wrong about you," he said. "From the first morning I decided before I knew anything, and I was wrong about it." She looked at him. He held the look without shifting. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry for it." She studied him for a moment, the genuine discomfort in his face, the fact that he had come to say it anyway. "You weren't unkind," she said. "You were professional. There's a difference, Bershis. Not enough of one." "Enough," she said. "I've had worse." He nodded once. He looked at her bandaged forearm, then at the kit bag, then at her. "Polish 68, he said. She waited. "Whitfield told me the distance." He paused. "I've been doing this for 12 years. I understand what that means." "Then you don't need me to explain it." "No." He looked at his boots for a moment, then back at her. "I just wanted to say that I understand it." She picked up the kit bag. "Good night, Stone." She left him in the vehicle bay and went to find Carver. He was standing on the east side of the building away from the activity, looking at the perimeter tree line, in the way a man looks at something that requires sustained attention when what he actually needs is a moment to stand still. He heard her approach and did not turn immediately. When he did, he looked at her for a moment, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He took out an envelope. It was standard letter size, the paper gone soft with years in handling. She could hear the difference in it, the slight resistance of something that had been folded and unfolded and refolded and finally left folded for a long time. On the front, in handwriting she knew from birthday cards and notes left on kitchen counters and the inside covers of books given to her when she was young. 2 words. Sloan. He held it out. She took it from his hand and held it without opening it. "He sent it to me before the deployment," Carver said. "He said if I don't come back, hold this until the right moment. He didn't define right. I've been defining it for 10 years and I've been wrong about it for most of that." He paused. "What I need to tell you, I should have found you sooner. I told myself I was waiting for enough context to offer alongside it. That was true, and it was also a reason to delay a conversation I was afraid of." He looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry for that." She looked at the envelope. "Your father was the best operator I worked alongside," he said. "I've said that and I mean it as a technical judgment. In Kuwait in 1991, he made a decision under a 4-second window that saved 11 lives, including mine. That is documented in a report that will never be declassified, and I have thought about it many times since." He paused. In 2013, he began running an inquiry on his own authority. No authorization, no official channel. Because the official channel had already received his concern, once in 2012, and the inquiry had been closed by the same command node he was looking at. Sloan stood very still. 3 operations had been compromised in the 18 months prior to that. He saw the pattern. He found Dean not completely, not with full documentation, but enough. He was building the case when the deployment order came through. Carver looked at the tree line. The route to the compound in Kandahar province was compromised before the team left the wire. Someone had the timing and the avenue of approach and acted on it. 4 people on that team. Your father was the only fatality. She heard this. She did not look away from the envelope. "Dean had the route," she said. "Yes. He fed it." "We believe so. The drives that were pulled from Building 7, some of those records go back to 2014. The forensic team will take months to work through them. But there is enough here now to open a full formal inquiry, and a full formal inquiry will find what it needs to find." She was quiet for a while. The evening was cool and clear, and the bass hummed at its usual nighttime register around them. "He knew," she said. "Before he went, he knew something could happen." Carver was quiet for a moment. "He was a thorough man," he said carefully. "He had been in situations of elevated personal risk before, and he had always taken precautions." She looked at the envelope in her hands. Then she put it carefully into the inside pocket of her kit bag against her chest beside the K-bar with R. Harmon on the handle. "Thank you," she said. It was quiet and it was complete. They stood for another minute in the cooling air while the bass moved around them. Then she picked up her kit bag and went back to work. She read the letter that night. She sat on the cot in the medical quarters with the lamp on low, and Ranger at her feet and the bass quiet outside the window, and she opened it carefully the way you open something that cannot be replaced if you damage it. The paper inside was a single sheet, folded twice the handwriting, small and deliberate. She read it twice. She sat with it for a long time. There were things in it that were hers alone, the specific language between a father and a daughter, the references that would mean nothing to anyone else. But there was a passage she returned to a third time sitting in the low light. You're going to want to keep the promise you made your mother. I know you. You'll hold it past the point where holding it is easy because that's how you love people, by keeping what you said to them. After keeping it stops being comfortable. But I need you to hear this. Taught you what I taught you because I knew you would need it. Not because I wanted you to use it the way I used it. There is a difference. What you do with what I gave you is yours to decide. Don't let a promise made in grief make that decision for you. Your hands can do both things. They always could. I saw it when you were 12 years old on a hillside in September, with the wind steady from the northwest, and you waited until the moment was exactly right before you moved. You always knew when to wait and when to move. Trust that. I do. She folded the letter along its original lines and put it in the inside pocket of her kit bag beside the K-bar, with her father's name on the handle. She turned out the lamp. She did not sleep immediately, but the wakefulness was different from how it usually was. Not vigilant, not processing. Present. The dark and the quiet and Ranger's breathing and the sensation new and not entirely comfortable and real of something that had been held tightly for a long time being allowed to open its hand. 6 months later, the room smelled of dry erase marker and coffee. 16 people sat in folding chairs arranged in 3 rows, and they were not alike, different ages, different branches, different levels of experience. But they shared the quality of paying close attention, which was the quality Sloan had weighted most heavily when reviewing the candidates for the first integrated training block. Capability was a given. She had selected for attention. Navy corpsmen in the first row, 2 Army medics beside them, a pair from a Ranger battalion who had applied through a channel that had not existed 7 months ago, and now did because someone had written the justification in the aftermath of a Tuesday night in November, and the justification had been difficult to argue against. In the second row, 2 more corpsmen, one of them 22 years old and looking at the board at the front of the room with the focused intensity of someone who has decided to be very good at what they are about to do. Ranger was at the far wall, lying with his chin on his forepaws. He was not asleep. He tracked the room with the slow, systematic attention that Sloan had stopped consciously registering months ago, the way you stop registering a sound that has become part of the texture of your days. On the board behind her in letters she had written that morning, "Drag them out alive." She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the room. 2 weeks of combat medicine, she said. 2 weeks of marksmanship fundamentals. The final week both at the same time under conditions that will not be comfortable. She paused. The goal is not to produce medics who can also shoot or shooters who can also apply a tourniquet. The goal is to produce people who do not have to stop being one thing before they start being the other. She looked along the rows. Your hands can do both. That's not a theory. It's a fact about what hands are for. A hand went up in the second row, the 22-year-old. How do we know when to fight and when to heal? Sloan held the question for a moment. You heal when you can, she said. You fight when you must. The hard part isn't telling them apart. The hard part is accepting that you might have to do both in the same minute and that neither one cancels out the other. She looked at the board. We'll spend 5 weeks on the hard part. She picked up the marker and began writing, and the room settled into the kind of attention that cannot be manufactured, the attention of people who have chosen to be exactly where they are. She thought about her father while she wrote. Not with grief, with something that had been working its way toward this shape for 10 years and had finally arrived. He had taught her in the mornings in Oregon that everything had a consequence, and that the clearest classroom was one where the consequence was immediate and undeniable. She was teaching the same lesson in a different room to people who would carry it somewhere she would not follow into situations she would not know about, and she thought he would have found that reasonable. She thought he would have found most of this reasonable. Webb came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into the block, his arms still in the sling he wore, with the irritated compliance of a man who knows he needs it and resents knowing it. He stood in the training room doorway while she reviewed assessment forms and waited until she looked up. I want to say something, he said. You've already said it, Webb. I want to say it again. She set down the forms. You saved my life twice, he said. In the same day. I've been trying to find the right way to say what that means, and I don't have it. He shifted his weight. My wife cried when I told her. She wants to send you something. Tell her I don't need anything. She'll send something anyway. Then tell her nothing with flowers. I don't have space for them. He laughed, genuine brief, coming out before he'd decided to allow it. Then he looked at Ranger, who was regarding him from across the room with the calm familiarity of an animal that has filed a person as not a threat, and moved on. He doing all right? Webb asked. Same as always, she said. Good. He looked at the dog for another moment. That's good. He left. She picked up the assessment forms. Ranger resettled his chin on his forepaws, and the afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and lay across the training room floor in long horizontal bars that looked in a way she did not examine too closely, like mornings she remembered. She called home on a Friday evening. She had been intending to call for 3 weeks and had found the distance between intending and doing longer than expected. Not from fear, from uncertainty about the shape of the conversation, what to say at the beginning that would make the rest of it make sense. She sat on the step outside the medical quarters with Ranger beside her and the phone in her hand, and the autumn sky over North Carolina going dark quickly and completely the way it does in that part of the country. Her mother answered on the second ring. Hey, baby. The voice was exactly what it always was. It reached past every professional surface Sloan carried and found the undefended place underneath the place that did not have a protocol. Hi, Mom. You sound tired. I'm okay. That's not the same thing. She smiled at that briefly in the dark. No, it isn't. A pause. Her mother had always been comfortable with pauses. She held them rather than filling them, which Sloan had always found reliable. The silence would wait. I need to tell you something, Sloan said. All right. I broke the promise. I picked up a rifle. I used it. A pause, moan. Someone was going to die if I didn't, and I made a decision and I'd make it again. The pause this time was longer. Sloan, her mother said. I know. No, listen. Her voice had shifted. Something in it Sloan had not heard before, or had heard and not recognized. Your father called me, before his last deployment. Sloan went still. He called from wherever he was, I never knew where, and he talked for a long time. He didn't usually do that. I knew something was different. A brief pause. He told me about the promise. He said he was glad you had made it, and glad I had asked you to because you needed to understand that what he gave you was a gift and not a requirement. But he said, her voice caught once very briefly, then steadied. He said, don't hold her to it past the point where it's protecting her. There's going to be a day when breaking it is the right thing to do. When that day comes, I want her to know she has permission. Sloan said nothing. He knew, her mother said. He always knew who you were going to be. He just wanted to make sure you got there yourself. He wanted it to be your choice. The night was quiet. Across the base, a vehicle moved along the perimeter road, its lights sweeping once across the buildings and continuing. He wrote me a letter, Sloan said. I know. A soft sound. He told me he was going to. He said the same thing, the same idea. Of course he did. When something mattered to him, he said it the same way both times. Her mother paused. Are you all right? Sloan thought about the question. She looked at Ranger, who was watching the perimeter road with his patient, professional attention. Yes, she said. And because it was true, better than I've been. Good. Warm in the simple way of someone who is genuinely glad and does not need to perform it. Come home for Christmas if you can manage the leave. I'll try. Try hard. She stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes. Smaller things, the texture of ordinary life. The house, the garden her mother had taken up since retiring. The neighbor's dog that kept getting into the yard. Normal things that did not require extraordinary circumstances to justify themselves. Worth coming home to. When she hung up, she sat for a while with the phone in her hand and Ranger warm against her leg, and she thought about her father in the mornings in Oregon and the things he had given her without knowing how long they would take to become what they were meant to be, the way seeds become something without anyone watching, without being reminded to grow. He had known who she was going to be. He had built toward it, one morning at a time in the early light, with the pine smell and the low horizontal bars of sun, and he had trusted her to arrive. She had arrived. She put the phone in her pocket and sat in the cool air. Ranger pressed his weight gently against her knee, the way he did sometimes, not asking for anything, simply present. The way he had been present from the beginning, since the day they put him in front of her in a room at the kennel facility, and he had walked past the handler offering the leash and stopped in front of Sloan and sat down. Nobody had trained him to do that. He had simply made a decision, the way animals sometimes make decisions, that the people around them take much longer to understand. She thought about the briefing in her inbox for Monday morning. A new assignment, new variables, new terrain, new people who would make their preliminary assessments of her and be wrong about some of them and right about others. She would show them what she showed everyone, her work, her competence, her attention, her hands. She would not explain herself. She had learned from the best available source that explanation was not the point. She thought legacy isn't what you do, It's what you leave in the people who watched you do it. Her father had left something in her. She was leaving it in the 22-year-old in the second row who looked at the board with that specific intensity, and in the 14 others beside her, and in whatever they would carry from this room into rooms she would never see. The chain of it mattered more than any single link. She stood up. Ranger stood up beside her, shook himself once, and stood ready without performance, without impatience. Available. He had always been available. It was the thing about him that she trusted most, not because it was trained, but because it was simply what he was. All right, she said. She went inside. The next morning at 06:30, she was in the dining facility. Same table, same corner, south end, the angle to the entrance clean and unobstructed. The coffee was black and the notebook was open in front of her, and Ranger was under the table, chin down, watching the room in the way she had stopped, consciously tracking, the way you stop tracking the sound of your own breathing, not because it has ceased, but because it has become part of the shape of things. The facility was full with its normal weekday volume, the sounds of a base morning. People eating and talking and moving through the ordinary routines that filled the space between significant events, the ordinary minutes that were in fact the substance of a life rather than the interruptions to it. She wrote the date at the top of a new page. The chair across from her moved. Everett Webb set his tray on the table and sat down with the careful arrangement of a man managing a shoulder that was healing. He looked at her. She looked at him. Okay, he asked. Yes, she said. He nodded and started eating. She went back to her notebook, and between them the silence had the quality of two people who have seen things together that do not have adequate description and have arrived at the shared understanding that description is not what's required. They had eaten in different configurations of this same understanding over the past 6 months at the hospital, the morning after the surgery in the vehicle bay 2 days later, in the corridor outside the training room during the first week of the block. Each time the silence had been the most honest thing available. Outside, the morning was clear and cold, and the base was alive in its routines and in the training room. 3 buildings north, the words were still on the board from the day before, waiting for the people who would sit in front of them in an hour and continue the slow, serious work of learning to carry both things at once. She thought about the hillside in September when she was 12 years old. She thought about the wind steady from the northwest and the way the light hit the grass at that angle, and the weight of the rifle in her father's hand making 2 small adjustments to her grip without telling her what they were for, because he never told her what things were for. He waited for her to find out. She had found out. She closed the notebook and picked up her coffee. Ranger's ear moved once, tracking something in the ambient sound, deciding it was nothing. He resettled his chin. In the training room to the north, the 22-year-old arrived 12 minutes early and sat in her chair in the second row and looked at the board with the same focused intensity she had brought every morning for 3 weeks. Drag them out alive. She was reading it the way you read something you have already committed to, not studying it anymore, just confirming that it is still there, that it means what it meant the first time you understood it. It did. Sloan Harmon drank her coffee and sat with the morning and let it be what it was, an ordinary morning, which was not a small thing. She had learned to know the difference. Her father had taught her that too, in the woods in Oregon, in the mornings that felt like nothing and were in fact everything. The briefing was at 0800. She was ready.